Welcome to this Impact Live session, Leading Through Climate Complexity. I'm Julian Birkinshaw, Dean of the Ivey Business School, and I'm delighted to be your host and moderator. Today, we're shifting the climate conversation from global commitments to what businesses can actually do now to move Canada towards its 2050 net zero goals. We'll explore practical actions from energy usage to supply chain transformation to innovation, finance, and the leadership decisions that turn ambition into implementation. And we'll discuss how firms can stay on track amid political headwinds and competing priorities. I'm pleased to be joined by three proud Ivey alumni and leaders who bring deep hands-on experience to this challenge. Tom Hewitt, AVP Sustainability at Cooperators, Tayan van der Poorten, Executive Director of Sustainability and Climate Services at KPMG, and Rob Klassen, Ivey's Associate Dean of Research. Please feel free to drop questions for our panel into the Q&A function. We'll do our best to get to your questions near the end of the discussion. Let's dive right in. So, the COP30 Conference of Parties conference finished about 10 days ago. It was in Belém, the Brazilian rainforest, a very different sort of setting, I think, to the last two COPs. One was in Azerbaijan, one was in Dubai, and before that, I think, was Egypt. And obviously, it was, as all these COP meetings are, quite a sort of fractious, challenging thing. It went on a long time. And they came out with some statements, some decisions, but I want to get your take on how well they did. Tom, let me go to you first. What were your kind of hits and misses from the conference? Not all listeners will have been actually kind of that involved. What did you take away from the conference?
Thanks, Julian. Happy to kick things off. Are we where we need to be to meet our commitments under the Paris Agreement? No. Is it clear which horse is going to win the race in terms of emissions reductions or avoiding loss and damage from catastrophic events? No. But, so that's two initial responses in the negative.
Yeah.
But I have to say, relative to expectations, we need to think about, we need to consider the outcomes that were achieved relative to where we might find ourselves in this context of nationalism and backsliding among some quarters. And in that sense, I'm delighted that we actually got to a deal. 190 some odd countries actually agreed to a set of commitments and a set of actions. And very importantly, there was no backtracking on past agreements, even if some weren't mentioned explicitly in this agreement text. So my feel of it is it could have been a lot worse. We're not where we need to be, certainly. It could have been a lot worse. And I think, we weathered the storm this year, and we continue to build and drive more towards execution in future years.
And what were the key decisions or key agreements for the benefit of the audience who didn't necessarily follow it that closely?
Yeah, there was a tripling of adaptation finance, or a new target set for 2035. That's quite significant. It's a later timeline that many had hoped for, and we're grossly underperforming in terms of actually mobilizing the finance required. But it's still an important aspect of the agreement. We stood up a tropical forest forever facility, as they call it, and I think about 7 billion was pledged to it. So this amounts to a tangible action in order to tackle one of the greatest sources of emissions in the last couple of years through deforestation. And I was also personally delighted to see the role that Indigenous people played, not necessarily within the room, but around it. And Indigenous land rights were formally acknowledged, I believe, for the first time within these agreements. So more room, more progress to make on that front. But progress was made.
Got it. Tayan, what are your initial thoughts when you saw the results of the COP30?
Well, one that stands out to me is that the renewable energy industry was really vocal in pointing out the dramatic growth in renewables and the fact that renewable energy now accounts for a large portion of additional demand. However, the fact is still that renewables make up less than 20% of the total global energy mix, and pace is not the same as scale. So renewables aren't growing fast enough, even though we are seeing progress, which is obviously positive. A clear message, definitely backed by scientific reports, as Tom said as well, that was vocalized at COP, is that electricity demand is surging, emissions are rising, and the world is drifting off of course of its original 1.5 degree Celsius above pre-industrial level course to closer to a 2.5 degree course.
Mm.
And the disruption that comes with that is physical climate risks like extreme weather and water stress and food insecurity and sea level rise. And that's going to disrupt supply chains, damage infrastructure, impact operations and workforce productivity, and increase costs. So for
Mm.
corporates, this new course isn't just a climate risk that's off on the side. It's a strategic one that we need to plan for. And so the
Mm.
hit that I saw was that there was very strong support at COP for climate transition plans. And then we're seeing an increase in demand of those from clients. And I actually helped KPMG International develop its first climate transition plan. And for those that don't know, a climate transition plan is a strategic roadmap that really outlines how a company is going to shift its operations and its assets and business to align with this lower carbon economy
Mm.
of the future. And it really shows investors and lenders and other stakeholders how its business model is going to remain relevant and profitable when climate disruption aheads. But the miss then is also then the electricity grid investment pledge from COP29 has not really seen real progress. So there's a lot of backlash on that, saying that from system operators and utilities warning that there's going to be, even though we need this additional renewable energy back on the grid, there's going to be grid bottlenecks because a lot of the grids are archaic and outdated or built for fossil fuels. And these delays could deploy renewable
Yep.
energy for a decade or more.
Thanks. Rob, what are your hits and misses from
Well,
COP30?
I may start with a more general point, which is the fact that COP occurred is a positive. Yeah, I think we need the ongoing conversation at a global level. This is not a problem that will be solved by one country or one sector. And encouraging this dialogue with an increasing number of affected stakeholders, whether they're indigenous communities or developing nations, is an absolute fundamental piece of what needs to occur. And so we need to hear those voices. We need to hear them frequently. And so this provides a forum for that and encourages countries to step up, the developed countries in this case,
Mm.
to step up with renewed commitments.
Mm.
And
And
so I would certainly, in addition, echo the point that Tom mentioned earlier, which is really that there is increased funding commitments. We
mm.
haven't seen quite the follow through maybe that we would have wanted to date, but this attention on adaptation, I think, is important for those the poorest economies in the world to have additional funding. And so I see that as an absolutely critical piece.
Right.
The one miss that I think has gotten quite a bit of press, and so it's not new news in that sense, is the lack of mention around fossil fuels and how they might a transition needs to occur there too. And there's reasons for that, of course, but one can't help but not mention that at least at some point.
Yeah, it's a bit dispiriting that fossil phasing out of fossil fuels is not even in the text. And as you say, we understand that there were some parties who just simply refuse to accept that, and we all understand that with the US not there, their leadership was missed. I understand that fossil fuel phase out is now going to be kind of continued as a conversation, but outside of the formal COP process, which is, again, better than nothing, but really not what we want. I mean, my question to you, Rob, is, I mean, it doesn't work very well, but I guess your point is it's better than the alternative. I mean, there is no better way of trying to get a bunch of sovereign nations to agree to make changes to their own laws than to try to get people together once a year and thrash it out.
Well, and I think there's a strong follow-on effect that, as well as that if we're having these conversations at the international level, businesses who are also operating across multiple economies around the world do see implications emerging as well in terms of their own business models. And so whether it's in the supply chain or whether it's in their direct operations. And so I think these events do help move that forward, sometimes not as much as we would all like, but the conversation is absolutely critical.
Yeah, good. So, I mean, that's COP itself, and obviously governments make their commitments. Whether they follow through is secondary and sometimes not actually delivered on. They make changes to regulations and rules, but we want to talk mostly about business because we are a business school after all. Business operates within this jurisdiction, but this framework, but businesses are making their own choices. So let me go to Tayan first on this one. I mean, the very simple question is, what can businesses do now in terms of climate, the climate emergency, in terms of getting to net zero, anyway, but with the backdrop of COP30. Tayan, tell me what your thoughts
Very
are on that.
simply put, number one, you have to measure and understand your sources of emissions. And the second thing is then to make a plan. And I would say there's big categories of where companies generally have those emissions. A really large one is on the supply chain side, which is generally like your whole value chain, which is more indirect emissions, which we call scope 3, but that's where a huge portion of most companies' emissions sit. So to tackle that, you look at supply chain adaptation and a sustainable purchase goods and services kind of plan. There's also obviously your energy usage. So the energy usage, procurement, and management of where you're getting your energy and how you're using your energy and developing a plan around that. And then there's your products and your services that you offer and looking at different innovations and how you can move the dial on that. If it's circular economy principles, is it reducing the waste and the water used, or is it when you're transporting your product, can you use more efficient ways of transport? And then there's other emission reductions such as methane if you have methane sources, or refrigerants if you have that. And from a professional services industry, one of our big ones is travel, because we don't actually produce products per se, but we do a lot of traveling to see our clients. So for KPMG, for example, one of our big ones is really looking at our travel policies and how do you kind of minimize overseas flights and enforce maybe train versus flights for short haul trips, and things like that. So that's the short answer.
Let me just dig a bit deeper there, because
Yeah.
at Ivy, we have made our commitment to net zero by 2034, but explicitly scope 1 and 2, just like KPMG, Ivy, as a professional service organization, the vast majority of our emissions are scope 3. There seems no, and I mean, vast majority, like 80, 90%. I mean, it's as that much as that. So there's no mechanism I'm aware of that will allow us to actually reach net zero across scope 1, 2, and 3, which is why we've committed to scope 1 and 2. So, I mean, reducing the number of flights, fine, but we're not going to reduce our flights to the level where we're actually at net zero there. We can take them down 10 or 20%, not 50 or 60%. So how do professional services organizations in general ever tackle their scope 3 emissions? I realize that's an impossible question, but I do want your thoughts on it.
Well, we actually do have a net zero target that is
Good.
we just have. And I'm actually part of developing our decarbonization levers to help us actually achieve that. And a big one is going to be supply chain and purchase goods and services, because it's so huge. So we do have a supplier target on how we're going to engage with suppliers to make sure that our top tier, like our tier 1 suppliers that we're using, have science-based verified targets themselves. So we know that who we're procuring from is actually doing something to reduce their emissions too, which also reduces our scope 3 emissions. And then we're looking at, from an energy usage perspective, we don't own all of our buildings. We do own some buildings. So the buildings that we do own, we can have renewable energy procurement, like purchase power agreement in place for renewable energy, or we can make sure that we're procuring renewable electricity where possible, either through contracts or. Go ahead.
But if we push it back to the airlines, let's just stick with airlines because everyone can relate to that. I mean, I realize that they are talking a lot about sustainable aviation fuel, which we may or may not think is an acceptable solution. But essentially, you're saying, we're pushing that responsibility obviously to the creators of those for what for them are scope 1 and 2 emissions, which are for us are scope 3 emissions. Is that right?
Yeah, well, what we do see is like a lot of companies do set these targets with the asterisk that, given technology will advance that far. But you can't, that's not good enough when you're looking from an investor lens. So it's going to be like, how are you actually pushing the industry and innovation to move towards those areas? So, we're part of SABA, which is the Sustainable Aviation Buyers Association, where we're trying to all work as an industry to push together sustainable aviation fuel, as you said, since that will reduce emissions a lot. But not doing anything is not the answer. Being part of these associations to help drive these movements forward is very important. It's not everything. So then you've got to, look at you really have to tackle it through so many different levers. So that's part of what I do for not just KPMG, but for our clients, is that we come up with, for your business and your industry, where are the different levers that you have sources of emissions, and then how do we tackle that? For example, before working at KPMG, I worked for a retailer, a massive North American retailer, and one of the things there was our products were the biggest thing. So we worked on transforming used tires, which was one of our company's waste streams, into floor mats, which became a new product revenue stream. And then other retailers are, loaning tools and equipment as an alternative of sourcing new virgin materials to produce new materials, new products, or like refilling stations for, shampoos and soaps like that. And there's tons of examples where companies are looking at innovative ways to reduce their emissions based on what their products and services are.
Okay. We'll go to Tom next. Tell us, both the question, what can businesses do now? And perhaps we can also segue into what your own organization, Cooperators itself, is doing now.
Happy to jump in on that. Yes, and to everything that was just said. And a common refrain you're going to hear from me today is, let's not forget the other side of the climate coin, focused on adaptation and resilience.
Right.
So my what can businesses do now immediately? My response to that would be, spend some time assessing your vulnerabilities to flooding, extreme heat, wildfire, severe storms, and hail. Assess the vulnerabilities not just to your own assets, but throughout your value chain. Identify those hotspots, quantify the potential financial impact of events, severe events now, but also into the future, on the assumption that a number of these assets will be long-lived in these relationships, these supply chain relationships. So get a sense of that risk today and in the future. And then importantly, put in place appropriate mitigations. If you don't have risk experts around you, I highly recommend seeking third-party support on that front. I've learned that in general, the collective we tend to have a relatively low risk literacy, and we have a hard time computing stats, even basic stats, much less metrics like, annual return periods and probable maximal loss. So get the expert support that you need to ensure that you don't miss a critical material risk that you face today and will in the near future, and begin building resilience, begin adapting your business to the risks that are already here today to a certain extent, but that inevitably, regardless of what happens at the next handful of COPs, inevitably are increasing and increasing rapidly. Last year was a record-breaking year for insured losses in Canada, which surpassed $9 billion. That's just what's insured. A significant more was lost in total economic damages and losses. I think globally the number was north of 300 billion US. So the trend is scary. It's going in the wrong direction, and ignore these rising risks at your own peril.
Got it. I'm going to come back to a specific thing you're doing at Cooperators in a second, but Rob, let me get you in now on the breadth of things that businesses can and should be working on. There's obviously a couple of other things that we haven't talked about.
Yeah, so we, I think Tan and Tom have really covered a spectrum of different options. And I think part of the challenge is now then drilling down and looking at particular businesses within particular industries. And I think the challenge then becomes to identify what is the most important lever for your firm, what's the most important activity that can occur, Is it a risk-oriented consideration, which Thomas walked us through? Or are there opportunities, as Tian mentioned a little earlier, that can be better leveraged within your business model or even adapted from where you are now in terms of looking forward and changing your business model? And so one of the challenges that, or well, challenges, I guess, opportunities that prefer to use that word, is thinking about where does innovation fit into this whole map. Innovation can address both sides. It can either address risks around climate change, or it can alternatively seek new markets and develop new services that customers are interested in. And innovation is a long-term game for most companies, often involving partners, often involving working within public policies or pushing to adapt public policies to favor innovation. And so I really think, as businesses need to think about what to do now, it's, well, how can I gear up on the innovative front from where I am? If I've done relatively little in the past because I haven't seen that as my firm's strength, start to take steps in that direction. Or if that has been a core asset or a core focus of the business, clearly advancing that and maybe reaching beyond, looking at partnerships outside your firm to advance innovation more quickly. It's really about moving more quickly with many of these climate issues. It's not necessarily about brand new to the world ideas. And so trying to think through how to best map that out and leverage the resourcing that you have.
So let me go back to Tom then on this, because you have the Cooperators Resilience Acceleration Lab is what I've noted down. Tell us what that is, and maybe this is a model that other companies can or should be building on.
Happy to get into details on this, and pull me back out if I get too excited about it.
Yeah.
Because I've been seconded to lead this lab for the next year and a bit. So this is an area of great passion for me at the moment. Yeah, look, we know that adapting to physical climate risk is going to require taking actions at both the asset level, such as hardening one's building materials, but also, very importantly, at the broader level of the community. For example, through enhanced and new infrastructure and large-scale programmatic interventions. Business owners can make choices and act themselves at the level of their own assets, but business owners don't have control of what happens within their broader environment. That falls to governments, most often municipal governments or regional districts. But guess who has the fewest revenue levers? And guess who gets maybe only about a dime out of every tax dollar that comes in? And who also faces innumerable other challenges? It's municipalities. Right? The Insurance Bureau of Canada and the Federation of Canadian Municipalities estimated a few years back how much would be required in investment each year to adapt municipal infrastructure alone. And they came up with the number 5.3 billion. There's currently work underway to update that number. I'm quite confident that it will turn out to have been grossly underestimated. There's only about 300 million-ish annually that goes to funding these sorts of infrastructure programs through public funding. So there's far more need than there's available money. So municipalities find themselves in a situation where they need to decide, do I assume that risk? Or do I get creative and start looking for other innovative partnerships or models or other sources of capital that can enable them to make the investments that they need in order to reduce that risk?
Right. Got it.
One of the challenges is that there's no cash flow associated with this sort of infrastructure because the purpose of that infrastructure is to avoid loss. Right? Picture a berm or a seawall or a restored wetland. So the question comes up, what role can private capital play? And yet we know the economics at the big picture are very compelling, something like 13 to 15 benefits to cost ratio. And we just need to figure out how to translate that compelling macro case for prevention into a compelling case for specific investments. That's the work that the lab is trying to do. Figure out how we can get more done faster at scale, bringing private capital in, leveraging the fact that we know the big picture economics make sense. We just need to translate that down into the case for specific actions.
If I understand rightly, I mean, these are what we academics call kind of systems problems, wicked problems, problems where no one individual part of the system can actually resolve them. You've got to get the various different people working together. And I think what you're saying is that the Innovation Lab is a mechanism, a forum in which we can understand better all these interconnections so that we can come up with better solutions. Now, there is an obvious challenge with that, which is that somebody's then got to take the lead, because we can't always just rely on governments, as it were, to, to sort of tell us what we should be doing. How do you then, having understood the opportunities as you described them, how do you then turn that into action? Does cooperators then take a leading role in enabling the change?
Well, that's exactly what we're trying to do. So we're a bit of a unique beast, and we've got three assets, I'll say, that give us a unique perspective on this problem. The first is we're an insurance company with leading climate risk capabilities. So we understand the risk better than most do. Second of all, as an insurance company, we are a significant institutional investor. So we got a big pot of capital, by the way, with a very significant mandate to invest that capital for impact, not just for competitive financial returns, but also to do good for society along with it. So we got this lever in terms of our capital that could be brought to bear. And third, as a cooperative, I think I argue that we inherently come to these sorts of societal problems from a different position than many others. We come from a position that's grounded in communities. We've got our advisor network is in 500 communities across the country, and people acknowledge that we're just a bit of a different beast, a purpose-driven beast.
Okay, thanks. So I'll bring Rob or Tayan in on this. So you mentioned the concept of impact investing. We know that sustainable finance is a whole kind of category of activity that we haven't even talked about. I mean, how should we be thinking about that, moving up from the specific of cooperators as you say, a rather unusual beast, to how other companies should be thinking about financing the types of initiatives we're talking about? Tayan or Rob, who wants to go on sustainable finance? Rob,
I'll let Rob go first.
Okay.
I'll just offer a quick perspective on that. I think really it's about the longer term. I mean, part of the challenge is that if you're focused very much on the next quarter, the next year, it's hard to think through and prioritize areas where sustainable finance is most likely to yield fruit or returns, for that matter, which is likely in the longer term. As additional monies are attracted and funds build, then you reach the scale where broader impact. And so we heard the statistics a little earlier about the growth in renewable energy. It's a vastly expanding area. And so you can think about to what degree are monies being directed at those sectors where we see the most promise.
But do we need governments then to step into, because obviously a private capital, goes where the best returns are, even if you sort of take a longer term view on the best returns, when you risk adjust those, given the uncertainties we're talking about, it's quite hard for private companies to put their own investments into some of these types of projects. Are we talking about governments essentially de-risking projects to build public-private partnerships? Is that the best way forward, Rob?
I think that's certainly one pathway forward, is to think about different, and I don't think all investors are the same in terms of a monolithic perspective on purpose and what they're trying to achieve. And so I think it's also providing investors with a clearer roadmap about what the organization is trying to achieve with these longer term investments as well.
Yeah. Tayan, do you want to add on?
Yeah, and I would say definitely when governments incentivize things like renewable electricity and provide incentives for, demand response programs and energy management programs, that's where the money is going to then, it makes it more cost effective to do such big programs like that. When we have geopolitics that kind of cease that type of activity in certain regions, it definitely slows down the progress. But I will say I do work with asset managers in terms of climate strategies and climate investment funds, where you're setting up guardrails of what we will invest in and not invest in. And I did work for an ESG risk rating provider prior to coming to KPMG, where I engaged with a lot of senior members, leadership of publicly traded companies across industries in North America. And investors were really saying, like, if you've got poor credit, poor ratings in terms of climate metrics and sustainability metrics, we will divest from you. So I was there to engage with them to say, like, look, these are the metrics you need to look at. This is where you need to move the dial, where these are your major risks that are not being managed right now. And there were some that decided, some of them were like dinosaurs and had a choice to become extinct or evolved. And the ones that evolved found new revenue streams and new opportunities where they hadn't looked before. For example, one of the companies used their natural gas pipelines for a lower emission product for renewable natural gas produced from the decomposition of organic waste. And then they can just inject that straight into the pipelines that they already had. And if they had resisted any sort of change or any sort of movement, then they probably wouldn't have had the investors that they had, but they improved their climate related metrics. They got a new revenue source and they enhanced their ESG risk ratings, and the investors stayed invested. So there's definitely the choices that you make that you can still look for opportunities with revenue, and then also have good on good, basically, in that example.
Thanks. And
Julian, if I may jump in.
Yeah, please go for it.
Because we've got actual experience with an impact investing portfolio, enough years now that we can meaningfully compare to benchmark. And our experience has been that compared to sister portfolios, compared to benchmark, the returns have been roughly the same. But the kicker is that volatility has been way lower. And our assumption there is that investors in impact are more likely to buy and hold. So effectively, our risk-adjusted returns for this portfolio are much better. So that's actual experience based on these investments. We're often asked, what's the trade-off? You're doing all this great impact investing. What are you giving up? The answer is nothing. We're actually gaining.
Yeah. No, I've seen a lot of data on what we used to call ESG investing, and as you say, it's there was a time when ESG investing kind of outperformed the general market, but I do believe that was probably a temporary thing. Nowadays, it's a very nuanced story. I mean, there are times when it seems to pay off, sometimes when more general funds do better. But I want to just segue from that point then to this innovation question. I mean, we touched on it, but I want to kind of build on it further. So if you go back to Ivy's basic statement of purpose, we talk about inspiring leaders for a sustainable and prosperous world. Sort of baked into our statement of existence is this notion that we want sustainability and we want prosperity. We don't want to make trade-offs between the two. So this is a double-headed question for all of you. I mean, give us an example where you've really seen a company through innovation actually create product, services, solutions which are both, more sustainable and more prosperous. There's a couple of nice examples of that would be great. But I also want you to acknowledge that, hopefully, that there's occasions where that reconciliation does not happen. I mean, there must be cases where, despite all of our best effort, ultimately there are trade-offs. Now, those two questions together, who wants to take one or both of them? Rob, go for it.
I was always on
I
the
saw you
opposite side.
smiling, so I assumed that meant you had an answer.
Yeah, you certainly asked the challenging question.
You're allowed to answer either question if you don't feel compelled.
So I can provide a straightforward example. It's not a new example. I mean, Patagonia is usually highlighted as a company that's done very well over the long term, appealing to a consumer segment with their particular goods. And so, you do see companies that do prosper in the long term, following a particular pathway around climate and broader environmental and social impacts too. But I know today's session's focused on climate. I think increasingly you're seeing as well new industries emerge where it wasn't before. So we think of just the simple example of infrastructure around EV charging, where you've seen new businesses develop. Clearly, that's a service in demand. It's still in a growth stage. And there are subsidies that have certainly fueled a lot of that growth too. So it's a combination of public policy, but consumer demand as well. And so you can see success stories of this. And there is I think, good on good was the phrase we've already heard, where you can see the two wins in that sense. But it's not an easy and apparently obvious everywhere how that can happen. And so I think, there are some trade-offs that sometimes do occur. And trying to think through, is it a short-term trade-off we're talking about or a longer-term trade-off where maybe basic science in some industries needs to occur at a much deeper level. And so trying to think through some of the challenges of that is a particular
Yeah. Yeah.
issue that public policy can really help fuel
That's right.
movement forward on.
Yeah. Tam, what are your thoughts on a great example of
Oh, well, I mean,
reconciling these? I know you've got
I've
lots.
worked at a lot of companies, and at each company, there's been something innovative and cool that we would try to push through to make a difference because we're all trying to move to lower emissions, and we have to be creative how to do that. And there has to be a business case to do that because internally, I could never sell that at any company I was at unless I could show that there was some sort of a reward for the company or some sort of benefit in some way. But just recently, one of my friends actually has like an anaerobic digestion company where he goes around and collects waste grease and oils from restaurants that would have been wasted and thrown out, and they convert that into biogas, which is then used as fuel, and it can be an input to renewable natural gas. That was a business that didn't exist before, but there's tons of those that exist where it's like, what are the waste products that we have? And like the one I mentioned before with the used tires that you can then, instead of just throwing these out and it's becoming a waste and an expense to pay for, how do we take our waste streams and produce a new product with a new revenue stream of something that we can do with that? So I think that is really like a trend that I'm seeing is companies looking at their waste streams and seeing like, how do we transport that into something new. I think IKEA, I've seen a lot of amazing stuff with IKEA lately in terms of their design, their sustainability designs going into their products to begin with. So you're using minimal product and resources to start with, and then they have an amazing refurbishment program and resale program, which I feel like they're preventing that big furniture from getting into landfills. So there's quite a few like that. And go ahead.
But talk about the leadership challenge here, because I'm conscious that we want to, most of us want to just do the right thing, and
Right.
we rely on innovation as the engine for allowing us to both deliver on sustainability and prosperity. But there's risks here for leaders. I'm from the UK, BP, British Petroleum. Two chief executives over 25 years have lost their jobs by pushing too quickly to make overcommitments to what they could do in sustainability. So what's your response to the leader who says, I buy this argument, but it's just too difficult. I've just got to actually essentially continue to deliver on the short-term needs of my stakeholders.
Yeah. The easy answer there is when we start working with a company, it's looking at that we set their ambition level. Because you're right. If your ambition level is too far ahead of what the industry is doing or what your shareholders want or what your stakeholders want, then you're going to hit some problems. So it's always setting like, here's what the peers in your industry are doing. Here's where you are. Do you want to be above the pack? Do you want to be with the pack? Or do you want to be a laggard that you're not going to get any more business from because people will choose your competitors that are doing more than you? So it's always looking at that first, so that in an innovation lab, like how far advanced do you want to go? So there's a lot of collaboration and buy-in and alignment that has to happen with how far you want to go without just stepping out too far and falling off the cliff for sure. And then from that, it's like, how do we get there? There's a lot of, there are different groups that you can work with that are doing some sort of small innovations that you can try and bring into your company, or there's stuff you can do internally that just you didn't have the management buy-in to do it. So it's really making sure management is aligned and has the appetite for it and how far they want to go before you can actually get any of these initiatives moving.
Thanks. Tom, your thoughts on this leadership challenge of confronting the sometimes impossible trade-offs?
Well, as Tan was speaking, I was envisioning the good old Diamond D framework for strategy development that I learned about at Ivy.
Yeah.
And her point's very well taken. Look, we're talking innovation here, right? So obviously there needs to be a business case, but there are always assumptions that go into business cases. If it were easy and obvious, innovation wouldn't be needed. It would have been done. So Tan's point's really well taken. Organizations need to understand themselves, management's preferences, their own resources and capabilities, understand their external environment, and then make the decision about, what bets to place accordingly. And I can bring that to life through a cooperator's example. If you were in Toronto, I think it was May 2013, or in southern Alberta or Calgary in June 2013, you may have experienced some of the devastating floods. At that time, Canada was the only country it was the G8 at that time, that didn't offer any private insurance for overland flooding. A really significant gap in terms of insurance coverings within the marketplace. And it was showing up in our books. We were hearing all about it. And it was not at all obvious that this would be a gap that could be filled within our Canadian context, given data availability and so on and so forth. But the organization made the decision that this is something that we needed to try to address. And we did the work and engaged the industry. And by 2015, I think it was, came out with the first overland flood insurance covering on the marketplace in Canada, shortly followed by a bunch of the other large players. And to this day, we're still the only insurance company in Canada, to my knowledge, that offers coverage even to Canadians in the highest risk flood zones, and coverage for storm surge. So those were innovation decisions that were made on the basis of who we are and why we exist. Our purpose is financial security for Canadians and our communities. And as it turned out, they were great business decisions. We could price the risk. We did price the risk. We grew the overall size of the pie. So it's great for communities, great for our clients, and it's great for our business.
Good. So, and by the way, I do absolutely agree that as we try to address the climate challenge, not exclusively, but to a large part, it is a business innovation challenge. And Ivy, as a business school, that's what we do. I mean, we absolutely work with our students on business innovation methodologies. We teach them about systems thinking. We try to get them to see problems in a rounded way. And I think that is the mechanism which is likely to be the most powerful. Let me just turn a little bit skeptical or sort of challenging for a second before we come out the other side on a more positive note. I've got a couple of questions here from the audience. I got a couple of questions even before we went live, just in emails in the last few weeks. People saying, essentially, I'm paraphrasing, why are you still talking about this stuff? The business communities that I'm part of aren't interested. We're throwing a lot of money down the drain. We're much more interested in AI or whatever it is. I mean, I'm speaking to the converted here, but what is the argument that pushes those people back in terms of we've got too many other priorities now to worry about sustainability? Tayan, do you want to go first on that?
Well, it's really simple. Do you want to have longevity with your business or do you not, right? Like putting your hand in the sand and pretending it's not happening is like the dinosaurs I talked about. You're going to lose investments, you're going to lose lenders, and you're going to lose business to your peers that are actually doing something. And that's why I actually have a lot of clients coming to me saying we're losing business because we don't have anything on climate or sustainability and our peers do, and they're choosing them. So if you want to keep up with what's going on in the world and you have to protect yourself from a risk standpoint, we can't ignore the climate change effects that are happening. Whatever you say, there's going to be more floods, there's going to be more impacts to physical infrastructure, there's going to be increased costs to business. So if we don't do something to manage those costs, then you're not managing your business well, right? It's an important strategic risk that you have to be aware of and manage.
And the Trump administration essentially has legitimized a narrative of skepticism that perhaps wasn't, in fact, definitely wasn't around 5 years ago. Your point is we've just got to keep repeating these arguments over and over again. The problem isn't going to go away. Let's go back to the science. Let's keep making the business case, right?
And to add one more thing too, like the whole ESG thing was frustrating even for people that are in the industry because that just came out of nowhere and became this huge thing. And it's too much and too big in one thing. I'm actually really happy in terms of the noise that's faded now because we just keep the fanfares over. We just get back to work and we put our heads down and we keep working. I've been in this space for over 20 years and I've weathered a lot of ups and downs in it. I think it's a bit of a dip right now, but there's a lot of work to do and climate is not going away and the impacts from climate is not going away. So we just have to keep going with with it, and the companies that have that ingrained in their fabric and are innovative and are forward looking are going to find ways to make that into an opportunity and make sense and revenue out of it in the future.
Rob, I don't know if you want to add anything to that. I'm sure you're going to sort of more or less endorse what Tayan said.
Yeah.
I want to, if you don't mind, add on a sort of supplementary, which is making it a bit local. Because one thing we haven't talked about at all, despite its importance to Ivy and Southwestern Ontario, is the whole regenerative agriculture aspects. I realize that's not explicitly a net zero story, but these things are all completely linked together. How do we ensure that we continue to invest in the right things here?
Well, I think it is actually a net zero
Okay, no,
story.
I stand corrected. You
Well, sorry,
you
that
know
wasn't
the science of
intended.
this better than I do.
I do believe regenerative agriculture can make a contribution to this. In part, it draws multiple threads of sustainability together, but clearly climate impact is one of them in terms of thinking about how crops are planted, harvested, or grown and then harvested. And so trying to think through again at a local level, and that's the very difficult part about climate conversations. We started at the beginning of today talking about COP30, which is an international agreement. Then we roll it down to the national level, but then there are individual actors within that, those are the companies we've spent much of our time talking about, rightly so. But it's also then at the local economy level where we see many of these impacts, whether it's at the municipal or whether it's farms and the farm communities that are affected. They're certainly affected with climate, but they also can have a positive impact in terms of their practices and how they configure their systems too. So, absolutely.
Thanks. Tom, I'm going to, if you don't mind, segue to a slightly different question. So we've talked a bit about, let's not lose sight of the science. Let's not lose sight of how much progress has also been made in terms of the science. I mean, the data I've got, you've probably got better data, but this is a quick internet search. Solar photovoltaic costs have fallen by some 90 odd % over the last 12 or 15 years. Wind, a little bit less, but still in the 50-60% category. Battery costs, electric vehicles, 90+% reduction in cost. I mean, are we now at a point where some of these things are genuinely, unequivocally better? Have we reached a tipping point in terms of actually, companies deciding what to invest in, so that we can take a very optimistic view that we've done all the hard work and now a lot of sort of market forces are going to take care of the rest? Or is that overly optimistic?
I don't think it is, Julian. It's a very important point to make in the context of any conversation that brings in politics and COPs.
Right.
That's one side of things. The economic side is another, and of course they're interrelated. But the story on the economic front, to your point, is very clear. The three electricity generation sources that have the lowest cost overall, all the costs in, are onshore wind, solar PV, and geothermal, right? That economic story is very clear. To your point, cost of solar is down 87%, I think, in the last decade. It's been 94% of installed renewable capacity in the past year has been lower than the lowest cost fossil fuel alternative. So when it comes to that use case, when it comes to those technologies, the economics are clear, and the capital follow the capital to understand the story. Now, there's more nuance because there are many other clean techs that are going to be required. Their cost curves will be at different points in terms of where they are and maturity. But the direction of travel is clear, and it's not going to change, because the point Tan made a moment ago is really critical. The science is clear, and you can only ignore the science for so long. Political cycles will change on a with much shorter time interval. The science is very clear, so keep your eye focused on the long term, and ignore the science at your own peril.
Right. And if I could just ask one of you about China, if you don't mind, because China's a little bit of a contradiction here, right? They are both driving many of the changes. I mean, obviously photovoltaic energy, solar, wind, certainly solar, perhaps less wind, certainly electric vehicles. China is now leading the world. And you can only ban BYD vehicles from North America for so long until eventually, we've got to kind of wise up to the fact that they're making, cheaper and better electric cars than we are. But China is also a great emitter. What is your, gosh, this is a pretty big question, but what's your view on how we tap into the really good things that are happening in China without getting into all sorts of a tangle about the geopolitics of it? I'm not going to choose. Who wants to answer that huge question?
I'm just going to
maybe I'll
say from,
start.
yeah, go ahead, Tom. No, go ahead.
Tom, you go. We'll go to Tom, then Tayan.
I'll start really briefly by saying the obvious, which is that two things can be true at the same time.
Right.
And we can look at where China, and let's focus just in on climate. There are all sorts of other issues and considerations, of course, that we could layer into this, but focusing just on climate, we can look at where China has been and where it is now in terms of emissions profile. But let's not forget to look at, again, direction of travel and the impact, the opportunities that they're unlocking through their exports in order to support decarbonization of all other countries and companies. I mean, that's really, it's phenomenal. The cost of the decreasing cost of solar and wind in particular. Well, we know why those costs have decreased so much over the last decade plus. Look to China.
Yeah, indeed. Tayan, did you want to add
I
to
don't
that?
have anything in addition to add to that. That's perfect.
Look,
Because there's countries that choose not to do anything, right? But they
Yeah.
are actually making a substantial amount of progress. So
Yeah.
that's
Rob?
the good thing.
Yeah, the other thing I will add, which is I want to pick up on a thread that I saw or heard in Tom's comment, is really that there is a legacy that is hard to reverse in the short term. And so if you've built a large volume or scale of energy source power plants that are reliant on fossil fuels, they don't turn off overnight.
Yeah.
But as the new capacity is added, it's what's the profile of the new generating options coming online. And over time, that will gradually shift. And so this is why, much of it is about portfolio management. It's about the long-term view, where there's steps taken now, and you just won't see immediate results, and it might take a generation to fully see some of the outcomes from that shift in policy. But it will come because as the legacy assets go offline.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one statistic, again, half-baked statistic, but I read that China now has more new cars which are electric than internal combustion engine cars. I think that was even last year. And so you do, of course, get to that point where it then becomes the natural thing to do. The tipping point has been passed, and then from that point onwards, that electric vehicles becomes the default. We're running out of time. I've got one question here which I'm going to use to tee up my final question to each of you. The question just came in. What are the mechanisms to help drive demand and grassroots support? I want to generalize that question slightly to the last question to each of you, and you've got a couple of minutes each, is one positive thing. We've had a good conversation. We've talked in general terms about what businesses can do now. Let's just try to be really specific. One, perhaps two specific things that an audience member can work on themselves rather than just asking somebody else to work on. Who wants to go first? Tayan, why don't you go first on this?
I'd say two key things to take away to work on is one, a climate materiality assessment. And if you can't do that, you can hire a consultant and work with a third party to do that, to look at your most financially material risks and your most impactful material risks. And the second thing is a climate transition plan, which I mentioned before, to help set the roadmap of how you're going to achieve what you say you're going to achieve.
And that the point of those two things is simply to, amongst the many dozens of things you could be doing, just focus on the thing with the biggest bang for the buck, the one or two things which will make the biggest difference now.
And my positive takeaway is that in the 20 years I've been in sustainability, I've seen enough positive change and momentum to still stay in it. So I still feel very positive, and I know we're moving in the right direction.
And to the grassroots question, if there's a mid-level person listening, I mean, because obviously they'll say, well, that's not my job, right? Any advice to them? They should be mobilizing a conversation about that?
Well, I mean, we work with a lot of universities and colleges too, and the amount of grassroots that's happening, like with the student level, like and my kids and the younger generations is incredible. It's just make the choices every day to do the right thing, to walk, to ride your bicycle, to take public transit,
Yeah.
to do something better with your waste, to not
Mm.
consume fast fashion at the rapid
Yeah.
pace that people are consuming that, and look more at products that last longer
Yeah.
and are made better. I mean, there's simple decisions that you make every day.
Yep. As you say, every one of us is making these decisions,
Every one of us is making
and
these
these things
decisions.
aggregate up. Rob, one or two practical
So
things.
the one that I guess I'm most conscious of recently is business travel. In some respects, there is some element of discretion around business travel and how much we do, and also the mode of transport. And so it's classified as scope 3 for most organizations because they're using, some form of commercial transit. But in terms of thinking about, can you make a difference individually? That's clearly one where you have some discretion over as well.
Yeah. No, it is an interesting paradox that, I mean, Ivy's not unusual in this. We both want to be sustainable. We also want to, run a global business, which involves inevitably travel. And we also want to invest in artificial intelligence solutions, which means data centers, which means energy consumption. And there is a challenge there. And I don't know if anyone's got a
Yeah.
complete answer to that. Tom, you get the last word on a couple of things to do.
Great. How about one at the individual level, one at the organization level? Individually, we've talked a bit about the shifting political winds and people being averse to conversation around climate. My advice would be, if that's know your audience and if that's who you're talking to, avoid such terms. Start talking less in terms of climate risk and more in terms of catastrophic risk, for example,
Right.
is one that the
Right.
insurance industry uses, or talk about protecting asset values or unlocking free cash flow. All relevant, just to reframe the conversation.
Right.
And organizationally, we've talked about supply chains in scope 3. So my encouragement would be, don't shy away from engaging with third parties. Don't shy away from collaboration, from public policy advocacy. It's going to be necessary for us to unlock what needs to be done. And there are a lot of great organizations and programs out there that can help. One example is Green Economy Canada. So if you work with small, medium-sized enterprises within your supply chain, check out Green Economy Canada. Reach out and see how they might be able to help. Full disclosure, I'm on their board.
Perfect. Good. Thank you. So some great tips there. This concludes today's Ivy Impact Live session, Leading Through Climate Complexity. We've covered the challenges and opportunities facing leaders as they push sustainability forward. We hope you're leaving with ideas that help you start or strengthen a positive climate conversation in your organization. A sincere thank you to our panelists, Tom Hewitt, Tayan von der Porten, and Rob Klassen, for sharing their insights. A recording of this session will be shared with everyone who registered, so keep an eye out for that in your inbox. For other thought leadership from Ivy on current business issues, visit ivyimpact.ca. As you exit the webinar, you'll be presented with a short survey. We would really appreciate it if you could please fill that out. Thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.